I need to tell you about The Farmer by Horrid Daydream. My grandfather Mobius was an avid writer who later in life became quite famous for some of his works under a pseudonym. He lived an interesting childhood and later in life lived in a village named Aldercon, nestled somewhere in the mountains and later abandoned. He was typical, quiet, kind, intelligent, and married my grandmother, who was the sweetest person I'd ever known in my life. When she passed away, and he moved into our home until the end of his life at the ripe age of 89, he brought with him many journals and manuscripts once forgotten. I enjoyed rustling through these boxes of his writings by the time I hit 12 years old and took a liking to writing. I found out more about my grandfather through his written works than I did through his own good word. And believe me, he told me a lot of stories before bedtime, or just in downtime, when he said to me, "A young boy needs to work his very hardest while he's still young," and his bones would creak and he would lean forward with a smile on his old, wrinkly face. One day, many years after he passed, I was back in the attic and found a journal that I'd never seen before resting inside an old cupboard of his. My parents had promised the cupboard to me when I turned 18 and got into my first apartment. So, therefore, I felt a sense overcome me that played on the thought that the journal simply must be mine too. I reached for it and opened back the cover, knowing that this could very well be a diary, judging by the looks of it, and that I may just be invading somebody's particular privacy rights. But then again, they did leave it inside my cupboard, and so I took the journal to my room and I began to read. In my village, there's a man named Robinson, known as the Farmer. He seemed like a nice old man, maybe misunderstood, and doesn't have a whole lot to himself. It's safe to say that there have never been any visitors. If he had a wife, he doesn't anymore, and if he had children, they certainly never visit. But yet, he's always giving me a big smile when I ride by on my bicycle, and if I wasn't told to never give attention to strangers, I might give him a smile right back. The elders never have much to say about the farmer, but I always see them going to his house. He'll invite them in, and I see him take them inside his house, and pretty soon they're leaving there, with big, wide smiles on their faces too. People around here are always getting old and having babies in these mountains. They know how to keep the cycle going. I asked my own grandpa and grandma about the farmer, but they just shook their heads and claimed that they didn't know him very well. But he must be doing business if he always has people at his house. I remember seeing an old woman in the newspaper, a nice picture of her in old age holding her grandchildren in her lap. It was her obituary. I learned that she had died of a heart attack that week, and that she was 70 years old. Imagine that. Back then, I thought that 70 was so old, but in all reality, she would have had so much life left in her. I had never seen a graveyard in our little mountain village, and I always wondered where they all went. The bodies, I mean. They must have gone to another village further away, which was not thought to me. At this time, I had just so much as heard of graveyards, but never actually seen one, and never lost anybody dear to me. The signifying thing about the woman in the newspaper is that she had a long scar down her face. Something so unforgettable and significant about her. Sometime within the next month, I was riding my bicycle down the road, and as I drove past the farmer's house, I saw him inside his doorway, peering out down the road, smiling and waving to me. I turned my head and pretended I didn't see anything, and drove my bike around the bend. Up ahead, there was a woman hobbling around the road with a cane in her hand, attempting to keep her pace, probably to make it back home. As I drove by her on the bike, I turned to give her a smile, and she cocked her head to look at me, and there was a deep, long scar on her old face, and something missing in the hollow-looking eyes. It was the woman from the obituary. I never said anything to my parents or grandparents, but safe to say, I didn't sleep well for weeks to follow. So many thoughts were running rampant through my mind, and I didn't know what to do with them. After a few weeks had passed, it was summer, and classes had stopped for a full month. I found myself with too many things to do with myself, and much too much time to get away with stuff. My parents were constantly telling me to stay out of trouble, but since I wasn't of working age or fit for a farm, I was always finding friends to pal around with and create havoc with in the center of our village. Then, one day, I found myself on the outskirts, riding my bike on the trail that led back to our part of the village, and I came to the farmer's house. There was a rumor around town that he had fallen sick, and people were deeply moved by this, as if it affected them largely in a way that rocked their worlds. I hadn't known until now that he was such a loved man for the supposed work that he did, and so I decided that on that day, in the midst of summer vacation, I was going to pay him a visit and see what this guy was really about. I knocked on the door and stood there on his front porch, feeling a lot like an intruder and a stranger myself more than usual, but nobody answered. I decided to walk around to the back of the house, secluded and covered in trees, surrounded by the forest, that seemed to swallow it in its whole entirety. As I pushed past the dark, swaying trees, I came to a clearing behind the home that was sufficient enough to call a backyard. There, stuck in the ground, was a shovel next to the garden. Inside the garden were carrots, potatoes, tomatoes, and the farmer. Only his head was sticking out of the ground. His eyes were closed. His face was quite pale blue, and he looked at peace. I never returned to his garden. The next week, I was riding my bicycle down the path, and I started to get chills as I came up to his house. I stopped my bicycle, right on the trail, and squinted my eyes. For a second, I felt my heart leap out of my chest. Looking back, sometimes I'm not sure if I conjured the memory in my own way, like my mind created a memory that never happened. But to this day, I remind myself that it was as clear as any other day in my mind. A memory so vivid that it absolutely has to be true. There, behind his front door, stood the farmer, and he was waving to me. A proud smile spread across his face. When I hit 18 years old, I took the journal and the directions to where Elder Khan once stood, and I headed off into the mountains. There was always the possibility that I was wasting my time, but as it stood, the journal was clearly in my grandfather's handwriting, and was, oddly enough, only 3 pages in length, then cut off abruptly onto blank, white notebook pages, never to be used again. I wonder if it was a story that hit home for my grandfather, one that scared him, so he boarded it up inside his cupboard, to never gaze upon its pages again. An incomplete story, something so real to him. I started back the dirt trail to where my grandfather grew up in the small cottage in their beautiful, secluded village. The trail went on for quite a long time. As I got deeper and deeper into the woods, no maintenance to be found in sight. There were foundations of houses all over the place, and scattered exactly like a place forgotten for good reason. I was sitting in front of a house. It was clearly abandoned by the looks. A door hung off the hinges, but the trees were gathered here to conceal the backyard, like they held some dark secret. And just by the looks of it, something inside told me that we were at the end of the line, at the farmer's house. I slowly closed the door to my SUV, and I headed back towards the trees, where they loomed and swayed in the crisp fall air, and dropped their leaves all over the yard, scattered about like something dead. As they began to close in on me, I finally came to the clearing and realized that I was in the backyard. There, for what seemed to stretch for miles, was a long garden, very much disturbed by time and torn apart by animals. There was nothing left inside it, just cold, dead ground, where vegetables used to make their homes. But as I walked down the line, I noticed more and more holes much too large to have housed vegetables, and torn up entirely like an animal had been digging for 6 feet under. It was then that I realized that they were large enough for a body to burst through the ground and climb right out. I left Eldercon, but never came back.